Hello and welcome to Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. In case you've forgotten what I look like, I'm Ken Coughlin.
And I'm Ben Lander.
And I'm back, finally.
This is Stay Puft.
This is Mr. Stay Puft. Mr. Stay Puft hasn't been on the show in a very long time, so I decided Mr. Stay Puft needed to have a return to the wonderful world of Trinity Talk Live. So he's not usually very talkative, so I don't think he'll contribute a whole heck of a lot, but he's here in case he would. But he's not mic'd up anyway, so we wouldn't hear him. Anyway, hey, welcome to Trinity Talk Live. For those of you that are new to the show, the byline there below says it all. It is water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective, which basically means what we try to do on the show is we talk about whatever people out there in the world are talking about, but what makes it unique is that we try to bring a particularly Christian perspective to it. So whereas there's no shortage of places you can go online to hear people commenting on all sorts of stories, including some of the ones we're going to talk about tonight, there is a shortage of places you can go where people are talking about them while trying to put Jesus first and foremost, which is what we try to do. And it is a conversation program. Obviously, Ben and I are going to talk. Occasionally, our lovely producer, my wife, Mary Kay, will chime in and she'll have her thoughts as well. But most importantly, we want to hear what your thoughts are on the stories that we go over tonight. And the way you do that is you comment. And we are currently streaming live both on YouTube, on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel, and on Facebook, the Trinity Joppa Facebook page. Whichever one of those formats you're watching us on, you can comment, and your comment will appear in that box over there to Ben's left. You just put it in the live chat on YouTube, comment section on Facebook. It magically shows up over there. It also magically shows up right here on the screen right in front of me. And then once there's a break enough in the conversation to bring it in, I will read your comment on the air, question, whatever it may be, and we'll respond and we'll interact and we can go back and forth. If by some chance I actually missed the comment because I'm so enthralled by what Ben is saying that I don't notice your comment, that same lovely producer I mentioned before has a series of very threatening signs that she holds up to remind me that, hey, Ken, look at YouTube or look at Facebook or something. There's somebody who's commented. So she's the backup plan. She also has a series of signs that are even more threatening that she holds up to let us know how long we've been talking. And so because I don't want to waste too much time at the front end, we're going to dive right into the stories for tonight. Normally what we do at this point in time is we recap any comments from last week's episode that were made on the YouTube channel after the fact. In other words, even if you're not watching us live, we love it if people are watching us live because it really gives us a good chance to go back and forth. But even if you're not watching us live, we still want you to feel like you can be part of the program. And the way you do that is you put a comment on the YouTube page of the video, and then we check the YouTube comments from week to week, and any new comments that come up, we will address them at the top of the show. There were no new comments that weren't addressed live on the air last week, so we don't have anything like that to go over this week. I do thank everybody out there for not pointing out a certain very significant flub that I made in the bylines last week, or in the little headlines down at the bottom of the screen, the lower third. Again, I apologize profusely for that. It was not intentional. We're not going to rehash it any more than that. You want to know what I'm talking about? Go back and watch last week's episode. You'll know it. So it was a big one. But one thing you guys did start talking about last week, and unfortunately, for those who didn't watch last week's show, I was not able to be here personally. I had to take Mary Kay's dad to the emergency room. So I was kind of commenting the live chat, but obviously that trip to the emergency room was something that came up at the last minute, and it came up after we'd already picked the stories. And there was one story in particular that...
Before that, your dad's doing all right.
Yeah, he's doing all right.
Good.
I don't know. He liked the show so much last week. Maybe he's watching right now. Good. I don't know.
It may not be good for his blood pressure.
Well, it might be good for my blood pressure when we get home if he disagrees with anything I say tonight. So he'll let me know. So,
yeah.
If you are watching, love you, Fred. But no, yeah, he's doing fine. Thank you very much. But there was one particular story you guys started talking about that we were supposed to talk about, and it had a little bit of a legal bend to it. And so you guys were on the air saying, maybe we should pick this up a little bit when Ken's back last week. So we'll do that. And that was, for those of you that weren't watching last week, Bill Cosby, as you know, was a while ago convicted of some serious sexual offenses. He was incarcerated. He appealed his case. And the highest court in the state of Pennsylvania actually overturned his conviction, and he has been released. He's out of prison right now. And this is not the type of overturning, or sometimes it's like, oh, okay, there was some technicality that happened during the trial. I hate using that word. I shouldn't use that, but something happened during the trial that might have been inappropriate. So you're going to be released for right now, but we're going to retry you later on. And so you might be going back into prison again later on. This is not that situation.
Not a
Hey, say
mistrial.
hi.
It's no
Katie's watching.
Katie's
Hey.
watching. Hi, Katie.
Hi, honey.
So also, I call my wife lovely all the time. You want to say anything about your wife?
I said, honey. Hi, lovely honey.
So in this case, he's not going to be retried because he's out. He's out for good as far as this case is concerned. And the reason that happened is this was not your typical scenario where, I was, for those of you who don't know, I was a deputy public defender for several years. I have a lot of experience in this area when I was younger and thinner. But the way a lot of these things work, when you have somebody, you can work a deal out with the prosecutor, and usually it comes up in the context of, your low-level drug dealer who they want to use to get the higher fish. And so what they'll do is they'll strike a deal with the lower one that says, in exchange for your testimony, for example, you won't be prosecuted, or what's more common is they'll say you have immunity for anything you say on the stand. So in other words, like if you say something on the stand, we can't use the fact that you admitted that on the stand against you later on. But if we have some other independent means of finding out that same information, well, then they could still use it. That's usually the kind of immunity prosecutors give. But sometimes they just give, because they really want you to just give flat out immunity. Like you won't be charged with it. Nothing. It's not just what you say, but the charge itself, it won't happen. Well, when those things happen, they're usually reduced to writing, and and it's a formalized agreement, and it's presented in court and behind closed doors, so it's not publicly known, but the judge is clued in. Different states have different procedures. That, to be clear, is not what happened in the Bill Cosby case. What happened in the Bill Cosby case was the lead prosecutor it was Philadelphia, wasn't it? Actually, well, it started out, Bill Cosby was being sued in civil court by one of his victims. And I'm not even going to say alleged victims. I'm sorry. For anybody that doesn't know, I think Bill Cosby is
Guilty.
Yeah. He's guilty. He's not a good man. Okay. But he was in a civil trial with one of his victims, and they wanted to take his deposition. Now, a deposition is where, the lawyers and the court reporter all gather in a conference room before the trial, and the lawyer gets to ask a witness questions, and the court reporter types up everything they say, and they're under oath, it's sworn and everything. And so it's not in a courtroom, but it's still sworn testimony that could be used against someone in a courtroom later on. Well, you have in this country something called your Fifth Amendment rights, which is the right against self-incrimination. Nobody can make you testify against yourself. If the state wants to prove you committed a crime, they got to do that on their own. They can't put you on the stand and force you to admit, hey, did you commit the crime? Because now if you did commit the crime, you're in an awkward situation. You're lose-lose. Either you admit to doing the crime and you go to prison for that, or you don't admit it, you've committed perjury, you go to prison for that. That you can't be put in that situation in this country. If you are called to the stand and you're asked something that's going to be you admitting to a crime, you can plead the fifth and say, I refuse to answer on the grounds that it may incriminate me, and I'm taking the fifth, pleading the fifth. Well, Bill Cosby was going to do that in this deposition. He was going to plead the fifth. Well, the lead prosecutor in Philadelphia went and publicly, I believe to the press, made a statement that Bill Cosby has nothing to worry about because we are not going to charge him, period. So it wasn't that formal written agreement kind of thing, but it was a public declaration.
The record of it, yeah.
Intended, there's no bones about it, intended to inspire or incite Mr. Cosby to testify in that deposition. And relying upon that, Mr. Cosby did in fact testify in that deposition. That prosecutor retires, new prosecutor comes up, and now we're in the situation where we have this criminal trial. They tried to use some of his statements in that deposition against him in his criminal trial. This time around, Bill Cosby's lawyer says, no, because the prosecutor said he wasn't going to charge him. So really, you shouldn't even be charging him, period, let alone using his testimony from the deposition. And I can't remember if they did charge him with that particular victim or not. But regardless, they were trying to use this testimony that he gave in the deposition, which he never would have given but for the state's attorney's promise. And then the trial court originally said, essentially, no, you're not entitled to rely upon just some public statement that they make to the press. And then the highest court in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania reversed them and said, no, prosecutors, you can't double deal. You can't essentially be dishonest. You can't as much as you're right, this wasn't a formal written agreement like you normally see. You can't make a public declaration as the highest prosecutor in the jurisdiction. This wasn't just some little lowly assistant, okay? This was the highest, this was the head honcho. You can't make a public declaration that you're not going to charge somebody for the purpose of inspiring them, persuading them to testify, and then say, psych, didn't mean it. Now we're going to go back and we're going to use all the testimony against you.
And even though it's not a written agreement, there is written record in the court records because of the transcription, court transcription,
right.
And there's video record of him making a public statement. So there's sufficient
and
record
so
of this.
I know the prosecutors in this latest case that went up to the highest court in Pennsylvania were complaining because they were saying that, well, under the court's decision today, this means that, it puts an undue burden on prosecutors. I mean, some poor prosecutor accidentally makes it the wrong slip up to the press, and then all of a sudden it could mean immunity for a defendant. And I think they're overstating the danger, to be honest with you. That was not what happened here. This was not just some accidental slip up. I mean, there's a number of factors that I think, in my mind, really weighed into this. Number one, again, this wasn't some assistant deputy or anything. This was the lead prosecutor for the jurisdiction, the one that definitely more than anybody else has the authority to dictate the policy of their office. All right. This was a public statement to the press about this topic with the clear intention to persuade him to testify, which he in fact did in direct reliance upon that. This is not something, I don't think there's any danger created here of prosecutors, accidentally saying the wrong thing. Oh, well, now you get off, scot-free.
Right.
It's really holding their feet to the fire. As much as I very much want to see Bill Cosby in prison for the rest of his life, at the same time, I don't want a judicial system where prosecutors can go back on their word and play tricks. I mean, that's not the way our system is supposed to work.
And I think that's the frustration with a lot of victims, even because that was really the case that began the whole Me Too movement. And so a big opposition to him being let go is that, this kind of undermines the rest of those and undermines the victims and their what's happened to them. As well as the other cases that were built from this.
Yeah, and I question why my wife. There's a leaning tower of books about to fall over and disconnect all of our cords. So if everything goes haywire in a moment, you'll know why.
Precarious.
Our lovely producer is now delicately picking up the leaning tower of Pisa. She's moving it back into position. Is it sturdy? Is it stable? Yay! All right. We did not go out. The stream is still going. You're my hero. So anyway, too bad we didn't have a camera over
Clean up your desk.
If we had a camera over there, people really could have gotten felt the tension that was going on in the room just then. Anyway, I don't know if you guys talked about this last week because I was having to tune in and out as people came in, but I know when I read one thing that I thought of when I read this story that made me want to talk about it on the show was the Christian perspective on it, as much as was justice done here. Well, if you define justice as far as, what Bill Cosby deserves for his crimes, the answer is obviously no.
Right.
It was not. As Christians, we know that there is an ultimate judge. There's a higher judge. And so you ask, will Bill Cosby pay for his crimes? Well, even that's a hard question to answer. The question is, will his crimes be atoned for?
Yes.
One way or another, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And I don't know where he is in his faith journey, but I had two thoughts about it. Number one is that this is one of those examples where we as Christians need to learn to trust in the higher judge. All right. Because we know the earthly judges and the justice system are flaws.
Imperfect. Yeah.
They're imperfect. I mean, this prosecutor never should have said that. Never should have said it. And so we do have to look at something like this and have confidence and trust in the higher judge. But then here's the hard one. Do we, and we all should know the answer to this, but I'm going to make you answer it anyway, so I don't have to be the one to answer it. Do we pray for and hope sincerely for Bill Cosby to find Jesus and to be the Holy Spirit enter his heart and be forgiven for all of these sins?
Yes, and this is where the rubber hits the road for a lot of for faith, those people, for Christians, for people of faith, where our flesh and our spirit are at war with one another, because in our flesh we want to see justice done here on earth right now. We want that vindication. But Scripture tells us, do not repay anyone evil for evil, but repay them evil for good, for in doing, or repay them good for evil. For in doing so, the Bible says, you will heap burning coals on their head. And God says, do not, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So there again, God is saying, look, ultimate judgment is mine alone. And so that's where we as Christians need to take a step back. As much as in our flesh we cry out for that vindication, for justice. And that's a hard distinction too. A lot of times we confuse or conflate justice with vengeance.
Vengeance, absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's a really hard fleshly battle to fight. But yeah, what we really need to keep in perspective is that, yes, God is the ultimate judge, and ultimately justice will be served because he is the only perfect judge. And so in the meantime, part of that repaying evil with good is praying for Mr. Cosby and praying that he has a come to Jesus moment if he hasn't already.
At one time, I actually approve of that term being used. Too many people have a come to Jesus moment, and it bugs me sometimes. So let's use it this time.
Literal
in this case, yes. So that's the hard part for me with something like that. It's like this is you're right. The rubber meets the road. This is the test of your Christian faith. Justice will be done, and justice in the sense that will a punishment be paid for these crimes? Well, be or has been. The answer is yes. It's either falling on Mr. Cosby or it already fell on Jesus Christ on the cross. And if we want to criticize and feel that's unfair, that Mr. Cosby shouldn't be paying the penalty himself, well, then we have to ask ourselves, look in the mirror and say, there, but for the grace of God go I.
Yep.
Because we all are in that boat. And if we tend to, and rightly so, don't get me wrong, we tend to say, look, but I've never raped anybody. My sins aren't as severe as Mr. Cosby's. No, but when you're comparing to a perfect, infinite God, your sins are pretty darn bad too.
Yeah. Any sin separates us from God.
So yeah, it's a tough one. But anyway, so that's what I wanted to mention about that one. Thank you for talking about coming back to that one so we can revisit the legal perspective.
Yeah, I think we briefly touched on it, but we were kind of running out of time at the end there. We think we mentioned something about that, about ultimate justice being served, but I appreciate your perspective and circling back to it. And it's a good reminder that sometimes we need to take a good look in the mirror and check ourselves.
Yeah, we also I mentioned the shack and how if somebody's having trouble with just the idea of forgiveness, that one of the good takeaways I had from that book, some things about it are maybe not completely in line with what we believe the Bible is telling us about the nature of God. But I think one of the things that it got right was the discussion about God's ability to forgive and his different perspective on things than ours.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for bearing with us as we revisit that story from last week, but I think there was some important conversation to be had there. Let's get into our first official story for this week. Ben, why don't you tell us about Mike Meyer's recent visit to space?
That's the only reference we're going to make to this. In case you've been living under a rock, there's a growing, what's being coined as a billionaire space race between, really three major players in this. It's Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson. And really, there's this race for space tourism. That's really the market that's being pushed here. So recently, Jeff Bezos launched a flight to space aboard the new Shepard rocket ship. So he has this new rocket ship funded by his new company. It's Blue Origin, and it's designed to serve, quote, the burgeoning market for space tourism. That's officially on the record what the corporation does. However, there's a lot of pushback from that. A lot of people are questioning, this is really just thrill rides for the super elite, the rich and famous. Mr. Bezos has come back and really kind of given it a more environmental spin. He said, quote, "We need to take all heavy industry, all polluting industry, and move it into space and keep Earth as this beautiful gem of a planet that it is." So that's his reasoning, that we're moving all industry into space. We're going to jettison all of our pollution into space because that's gonna be the solution. We're not creating an ozone. We're not creating a greenhouse effect in our atmosphere. We're gonna create it around our atmosphere instead. So sorry, a little tongue in cheek. But again, that's gonna take decades to achieve. Now, officially, what's unique about this launch is that it had both the oldest and the youngest person to ever be in space. The oldest person was Miss Funk. She is 84 years old, I believe. 82, I apologize. Wally Funk was an 82-year-old pioneer of the space race. And then the youngest person was an 18-year-old student who went on this flight. So basically, Mr. Bezos, this rocket from Blue Origin, it has a capsule at the top. And when it reaches a certain point, there's this flight trajectory that it goes up to what's pretty much considered the line where you cross into space. It's called the Kármán line. It sits at 100 kilometers above the Earth. And so this rocket jettisons up just to right underneath that Kármán line. Then the capsule at the top ejects, and of course, the crew is in that capsule, and they are able to experience weightlessness when they pass the Kármán line, and then they come back down and they parachute down. So the idea for this rocket is that it's reusable. That's one of the appeals for it. It's reusable. So kind of, again, it's this space tourism. You can keep going back to it. So the capsule and booster take off. They separate around 250,000 feet, 76 kilometers, and then they continue to about 350,000 feet or 106 kilometers, so just above that Kármán line. And then the booster lands about 2 miles from the launch pad, and the capsule then parachutes back to the desert floor. So really, we call it a space launch, but they were in space for 4 minutes,
Right.
all of 4 minutes. The entire launch itself was only about 10 minutes, so it's very brief. But it is being hailed, I guess, a little bit as, well, I mean, it is an achievement. And to commemorate that, they had certain things that were commemorative, like let's see, the goggles from Amelia Earhart, a medallion from the first hot air balloon, a piece of canvas from the Wright brothers' first plane. So there's some pretty interesting things that they took up with them, and then came back. So that's it in a nutshell. What's your take on the billionaire space race?
Well, I'm not a billionaire, so I'm not going to space anytime soon. That's my take. Yeah, there was Richard Branson and his craft just went up to space. I think it was last week as well, and he's got a very different design where his is almost look like an airplane almost look to it, and it actually gets carried up to a certain point by another plane and a craft, and then it gets dropped, and then it glides and it shoots its boosters, and then it takes up off into space. Same kind of thing. It's up there for a few minutes, and then it kind of glides its way down and lands. And his was also successful, like I said, just this last week. And I was reading in an article about his that it said the estimate is that when they start this space tourism industry, that it's going to cost around $250,000 a flight, per flight, per person, per flight. And they're saying, and we're hoping that, due to volume over time, that the prices will come down. So, if that price is too high, don't worry. 10 years, it might only be $200,000 per person. So yeah, it's clearly, this is, tourism for the mega rich. All right. Mm-hmm. That now, in regard to Mr. Bezos's explanation about, well, I want to take all of our garbage and put it in space. I mean, if he's serious about that, which part of me thinks that he just didn't see the criticism coming and just kind of spoke, and the word just kind of came out, space garbage, I just think that that's naive. It's like, look at the detrimental effect that, a lot of the garbage dumping has done on our own planet. Do we really know what the impact would be of, let's take all our toxic waste and put it up in the upper atmosphere? I mean, seriously.
So it comes back in 100 years as a giant meteorite or crash.
I mean, I don't think we know enough about space to say whether that's a responsible decision to make or not.
Okay, don't we already have a bunch of space junk flying around up there?
Well,
yeah,
old satellites and things like that, yes.
And a lot of them come crashing down.
I mean, they burn up in the atmosphere if they do, but that's... yeah, I mean, I don't know. For all we know, we set up our space garbage, and then our space garbage. And I'm not
just because something burns doesn't mean. I mean that stuff. There's byproducts of that chemical reaction.
Well, yeah,
Sure.
and that's the point. Is that
Yeah.
do we really know what the impact would be of putting our garbage in space, and is that even a cost-effective? I mean, I guess it's better than the Wall-E scenario, where yeah,
It's true.
the whole planet gets covered in garbage, so we all have to take off into space. Maybe that's what they're gearing up for. But now, that being said, now in regard to the criticism of Mr. Bezos, I can see both sides to this. I mean, at one point, there's, the criticism being, oh, this money could have been spent on environmental causes. It could have been spent on raising the salaries of your employees. True. The flip side of the coin, though, is that, well, first of all, Mr. Bezos this isn't Amazon, for example. This is a new company. He's not the CEO of Amazon anymore. He resigned from that. And so this wouldn't be increasing Amazon employee salaries. It's a totally different company. But even if it was, the way business works in a capitalistic society is you want to increase your employee's salary. Well, the more money the company makes, the more it can. In other words, some portion of the any CEO has got to do a balancing act. You want to keep your employees happy, and a good CEO is going to do that. If you keep paying people minimum wage and they're doing jobs that are above minimum wage jobs, you're just not going to keep good quality workers. You don't keep good quality workers, you won't be able to maintain making a good quality product, and then you're going to go out of business. So you do have a responsibility as a good business owner to pay your employees what their work is worth. Mm-hmm. And if you don't do that, then you're not going to keep good employees, all right? And you're going to fail. The flip side of the coin is you also have to take some amount of your profits and reinvest them into new innovations in the company in order for the company to continue to make money and make more money so that you can continue to stay in business so you can pay your employees. I mean, there's a balancing act. And I think too often in this country, people tend to look at all one or all the other. It's just like, oh, no, they need to make as much money as they can, or, oh, no, you need to pay your employees as much as you can. Whereas really, if you're running a business, you've got to do a balancing act in there in the middle. This company was designed for the sole purpose of this space tourism. So if they didn't invest money in space tourism, they got nothing. Their employees are all going to be fired. Okay. And also I'm a firm believer, generally speaking, the private sector does better than government and things like this. And just case in point, you look at the space shuttle was first launched in the late 70s, I think it was the late 70s. And then NASA did nothing to modernize, essentially very little to modernize their space program and their ship, until the retirement of the space shuttle. Now they're not really in the business at all, except sending up occasional rockets with satellites and things like that. When we go to the International Space Station, we pay the Russians to take us up there. Okay, think about that for a second. Yeah, we pay the Russians to take us up to the International Space Station. All right. Look at the design of the space shuttle. It was one thing that impressed me most about both of these craft is their reusability. I mean, the space shuttle would go up, and while the shuttle itself was reusable, the fuel tank and the thrusters were not. They would be jettisoned and they would be destroyed. The tank would be floating off into space garbage, and the thrusters would fall into the ocean. So we've already seen an example here where competition amongst these different companies in the private sector has resulted in the development of spacecraft that are superior in some respects than anything that was made by our government. Now, these spacecraft are not traveling to the International Space Station yet, but you use my thinking is you use the rich people's money, to fund the company, because and the company can have the money to continue further development to create additional spacecraft that now our government may want to contract out. And so now we have the private sector who is paying for and creating better spacecraft, and now we can go to the International Space Station on our own. Now we can go up and perform scientific experiments on our own. In other words, I see the potential market for this to be a lot broader than space tourism. I see space tourism, frankly, right now, and I don't want to sound mean to rich people, I'm not one of them, as basically a way of using their money to give us the capital to advance it to more scientific, educational purposes down the road.
Yeah, and advancing the technology. No, I agree with that. One other thing that I just have to point this out.
You're not going to point out what we agreed not to point out, are
you? No, not that. No, this is an interesting experiment because I just had to do the math on this. All right, so take a guess what Jeff Bezos' current net worth is.
$14 million.
I knew it. Without using Google.
Now stop.
without using Google. Jeff Bezos' net worth is $203.7 billion.
$1 billion, yeah.
So, and I did this research, 200 billion $1 bills stacked on each other. The height of that is 15,573 miles. They would reach 15,573 miles or 21,843 kilometers. Now, the Kármán line, which is officially where you reach space, is only 100 kilometers. So you take that, divide it, or take 21,843 kilometers, divide it by 100. Jeff Bezos could go to space 218 times on 218 separate stacks of $1 bills and still have $700 million left over. I found that astounding, and I don't know why in the world anybody needs that much money. That being said, we have a comment.
Pastor Jay was guessing. He said it was 200 billion. What'd you say?
203.
Whoa!
Yeah.
You Googled. And I'll give you credit.
And you win nothing.
You should win the extra 3 billion, the difference.
3.7 billion. But yeah.
And give him credit, because for people that don't realize, there is a delay on YouTube. So I'm giving Pastor Jay credit here. I'm sure he typed that in before you revealed the answer, just based on the timing and how YouTube works. So
Yeah, well, that was a good guess.
that was a very good guess. Makes me think he Googled it.
But no, I mean, I think like something like that is just astounding to me, that you can go to space 218 separate times on stacks of $1 bills and still have $700 million
I don't know if
left
you can
over.
climb that many $1 bills, though. And I think
Yeah.
they might. I'm just,
I mean, as a practicality, yes, this is all hypothetical. But yeah, so that to me,
You have to use the rest of that money to have guards to guard the bottom of the stack. so that
people would start taking
so nobody starts playing Jenga.
all 218 stacks.
So nobody starts playing Jenga with your stacks.
Yeah, so I guess the Christian perspective on this is when we see the mega rich and we see things like that, it could be used for the benefit of our society. Is it the best stewardship of our money? And again, this is his money, right, he's earned. So maybe we're not in a position to.
Well, I guess it depends on how you
judge that.
calculate. Sarah Cosby gives us a heart on Facebook. Thank you,
Cool,
Sarah.
thank you, Sarah.
I guess it depends on how you define net worth. And here's the problem I have. All right, whenever you see these net worth numbers, all right, understand that the way rich people have money, all right,
It's invested.
it's invested. All right, it's value of shares that they have in companies, for example. Like I'm sure Jeff Bezos has probably at least a 51% interest in this company. Maybe not. Maybe it's publicly traded. He's got less than that. I don't know. But he's got the majority shares, or the largest. He's the largest shareholder, I'm sure, of this company. And so that counts as his net worth. But understand the way stocks and everything work in publicly traded is that money is not like in a bank account for him to go get. It's being used by the company as an investment in advancing this research.
Right.
So
Doesn't it also include the value of property that he owns?
it's a real
Any
I mean,
kind
it's
of
less.
investment,
It's probably
yeah.
including a whole lot of non-liquid assets.
Yeah.
and
Pastor Jay has
he's
also.
asked a question, which is actually what I was getting at here, though. Okay, because then he asks, what would you do with $200 billion as a Christian? Would you ever get to that amount? And that's where it's like I'm kind of giving both sides. I'm saying, look, when we see $200 billion net worth, we do have to be fair and understand that that's not all like liquid assets. Okay,
Right.
It's not, and a lot of that money, while technically it's attributable to him and his net worth, is actually money that's being used by the businesses to
companies.
advance everything we were talking about before. Okay, so those are kind of overlapping financial pools, if you want to call it that. That being said, I'm sure he's got an awful lot of liquid assets. And would you ever get to that amount? I could stand to be corrected, but honestly, as a Christian, I don't see how. I don't see how. Because you just don't store up treasures here on earth, store them up in heaven. I don't need to have, if I have money that's, again, tied up investments and it's being used for certain research things, that's one thing. If I've got 15 zillion beach houses, and even with the real estate issue you were talking about, Mary Kay, I think it's what comes into play, because you don't need 15 zillion beach houses, all right? Well, they're an investment property. Yeah, okay. Your investment property is to make more money off of them. You don't need that.
More money,
you know?
Did you see the sorry, just one thing you said, did you see the Babylon Bee article where it talked about going to name a name, but this was in the Babylon Bee article, and said Joel Osteen decides to diversify his portfolio and not only invest in heaven anymore, not only invest his treasures in heaven, because he's diversifying his portfolio. Sorry, I made me think of that. But
so,
let's
I mean,
continue.
just imagine what kind of, in order to get there as a Christian, okay, imagine what kind of inflow you would have to match the, you know, what would be the outflow to only live off of what you really truly needed
Well, if God
in
blesses-
order for your value, your net worth to stay there.
Well, and that's, I guess, yeah, and right, and that's the point. It's like, if God blesses me tomorrow with $200 billion, okay, what am I going to do with it? I mean, it's a stewardship thing. If you really look at it as all these things belong to God, if God's given you that, He didn't give it to you to own 15 different beach houses around the world, okay?
Right.
And so what are you doing with it? Are you hoarding it, or are you using it for His glory?
Or private planes for your ministry.
Or private, we'll get to that. Yeah, it's amazing how the stories kind of tie together in that regard. And so I just don't see a way as a Christian that you get to that degree of personal wealth. And the more liquid wealth that's making it up, the more problematic it is for me.
Yeah, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Jesus himself. That's not to say, there is a balancing act there that you can have things without the things having you, right? And so it's really a heart issue. It is a stewardship issue. It's we are blessed by God, not for our own personal gain, but we're blessed in order to bless others, to be a blessing, and and that's really is a stewardship thing. So no matter what we have, there's not a set amount that God requires per se. But He loves a cheerful giver, so, and that's, again, ties back to the heart issue. So as a Christian, I don't know if we can answer. I don't think that there is a hard and fast answer of how much money is too much money.
Hard and fast, no, but I'll tell you it's a heart question. Because it's quite, someone like Jeff Bezos probably feels like he's the most secure man in the world because he's got so much money he's taken care of. If Jesus comes tomorrow, I got news for you: your money ain't saving you.
It's the foolish man who stored all his money in his barns and his excess, and God says, "You foolish man, this very night your life will be required of you," right? And so you can't take it with you.
Yeah, it does nothing. And so that's where I think where you draw the line is when you're. And it's an honest conversation we have to have with ourselves. If you get to the point where when you are trying to find out, well, do I feel secure or not? And you're looking at your bank account balance, all right, to determine whether or not you feel secure. That's when there's a problem,
right?
And it could be either way. It could be, well, I don't feel secure because I don't have enough, or it could be I do feel secure because I have so much. But if that's where you go, then, and if you do get to the point where you go so much, it's like, I feel great because I've got so much in savings. Well, then where are you putting your trust?
Yep.
So be responsible about it, be good stewards of it, but make sure that, God is God and the creation is the creation.
Yeah.
So
well said.
All right. So we move on to our next story.
Sure thing.
All right. So our next story comes out of my pocket, which is where my glasses are so that I can read it. And then it comes out of Bethlehem Baptist Church. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar or haven't heard of, I keep hitting Mr. Stay Puft. I'm sorry, Mr. Stay Puft. Bethlehem Baptist Church was the church of John Piper, where he was the lead pastor there for around 30 years or so, I think, before he retired. I didn't find the exact date, but not too long ago.
2012?
2012? No. I didn't.
Well, that's when the new pastor succeeded him, was 2012.
Okay.
So somewhere around there.
So it was.
Pastor Jay, I assume, is still on the last story and wants to know if Bitcoin counts.
Does Bitcoins count?
Well, Elon Musk accepts Bitcoin as payment for Teslas now. So,
well,
so I guess it does.
Apparently it does. If you can buy a Tesla with it, it counts. That's the test.
Is it liquid?
In theory, definition of liquid. If you can literally use Bitcoin to purchase an item, a product, then yes, by definition, that's a liquid asset.
Mm-hmm.
He apologized.
I'm sorry, we moved on. We've never truly moved on.
No.
So, always willing to come back. Anyway, so what happened here is that, so I guess it was 2012, longer ago than I thought it was, but still not that long ago. that John Piper stepped down, and he was replaced by a gentleman by the name of Jason Meyer. And Jason Meyer, I guess, was I got the impression he'd been a pastor working there at Bethlehem, and then he was kind of moved into the lead pastor position. And while he was there, apparently one of the things he did, because Bethlehem has multiple campuses, and I get the impression, well, never having seen one of the services back then, it sounds like that John Piper was basically responsible for delivering the messages through remotely to all the campuses. And so one of the things that Pastor Meyer did while he was there is he set up campus pastors who were kind of responsible for teaching individually at the individual campuses around there. But the reason this is in the news right now is that Mr. Meyer, after only being on the job for about 9 years or so, has stepped down. He's resigned from the position of Bethlehem Baptist Church. As a matter of fact, he is the fourth pastor from Bethlehem Baptist to resign since this past March.
Not that single campus,
not
but
across their campuses, right. And one of them was a gentleman by the name of Brian Pickering. He was the former pastor for care and counseling. And Mr. Pickering spoke to an investigative journalist, Julie Roys, and said that he believed that there's harm being done by the church leadership, especially the elders at Bethlehem Baptist. And keep in mind, this article that we read from the Christian Post actually didn't say any reasons why Pastor Meyer resigned. We don't know.
Yeah.
But this is one of the other pastors who resigned, who's saying these, and he thinks there's harm being done by the church leadership. There's unethical behavior, there's domineering, there's bullying, cultural damaging behavior that's being done and has been done for a long time. Is what it says. Now there's a lot of people that have spoken out as being kind of upset that Pastor Meyer resigned. But I'm glad you found that 2012 date. I didn't pick up on that because he was there for 9 years or so now, and I guess the fact that he resigned after 9 years, at first I was under the impression that it was sooner than that, and so that's why we're getting all these headlines. Oh, look, he was just filled the position and now he's resigned. 9 years. Do we have an expectation of some of these churches just because John Piper was there for 30 that every pastor is going to be there for 30 years? Do you have churches that are only going to hire younger pastors because they expect those younger pastors to be leading them for 30 years? I don't think.
Actually, 30 years is rare.
It's rare
in pastorship.
And 9 years is, not that Pastor Jay don't start counting down to 9 years and when you get to leave. That's not what I'm saying, but it's not uncommon, for a pastor to have a different call at that point in time. But the bigger part of the story, I guess, is, at least in my mind, is the alleged treatment and the unhealthy spirit that seems to be, at least according to this one pastor, permeating the church.
Can I ask how old he was?
He looks young.
He looks young. Yeah, I don't know exactly. It doesn't say how old he is.
Probably somewhere between Ben and me.
I'd say that's a fair estimate, maybe.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think you're right that the bigger issue is kind of not necessarily coming from Pastor Meyer because he hasn't given a reason for his leaving, but the bigger story here is what seems like an exodus of pastors from all these different campuses of Bethlehem Baptist. That he's the fourth pastor in a matter of months to leave, and now the only one that has given statement on the reason why has been Pastor Pickering. But presumably the other ones, even though they haven't said anything, I think this may have contributed to it. Now that story goes into there being and the pastors being downstream of a congregational exodus too, is what one of those articles said, that people had been leaving the congregation because of, among other things, one of the things being a toxic culture of bullying and what he's described, Pastor Pickering at least, as bullying behavior, exclusive behavior by the eldership to other elders and congregants. And it highlights one of the things it highlighted was there was a racial reconciliation task force that was brought on to kind of examine, because when they went to other churches in the area, Bethlehem Baptist Church was described by some of those churches as a white church that's not really engaged with the black community. And so this racial reconciliation task force wanted to do a an audit, basically, of the culture of the church. They put in around, I think, 800 hours is what they said. And so came back and told the eldership, and the eldership basically did nothing about it. And so a lot of those people on the task force felt marginalized further and decided to start leaving. And then some of these pastors presumably started speaking out. So I guess that's kind of the ethos, at least presumably or allegedly the ethos there. There hasn't been official comment from the elders of Bethlehem Baptist Church, although anytime that you've got pastors leaving, especially when you've got so many in a short amount of time, it's cause for concern to take a step back and examine why, and ask ourselves, and like we said before, hold a mirror up and don't be afraid to examine ourselves, and take that plank out of our own eye before pointing out the speck in somebody else's. And I guess from a Christian perspective, we certainly pray for the leaders of Bethlehem Baptist, but also the congregation, because that's there's a lot of damage that can be done and a lot of division that could be made when things like this happen. But that's not to excuse if there is this kind of behavior. There should be accountability too if there's this kind of behavior going on. So it's a delicate subject, a delicate approach to it. I would join the church in seeking God and praying for wisdom for them and honesty and openness and transparency. And I think that's the call that the pastors are calling for. Those who have left have said for greater transparency of the elders and leaders to the congregation. And so we pray for that as well, because that's, biblical.
All right, we've got a lot of comments.
Okay.
Let's. I'm going to read them all because they're kind of connected, and then we'll address them. On Facebook from Pastor Richard Blue. How you doing, Pastor? I haven't got to say hi to you in a while. How you doing? He's got two comments here, and his go back to when we were talking about, how long pastors stay, and that said 9 years is not uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
And he says average pastors stay less than 3 years in the current landscape of pastoral ministry. Mix of declining churches, dysfunctional congregations, and declining budgets. And then Pastor Jay on YouTube says, not being snarky, how does this, it's a sincere question here again, how does this affect us? How do cool pastors falling down affect us? And then he goes on and says, because I believe it does affect us overall. And then I don't know exactly what you were saying when he said this, but he says, keep going, Ben, you're getting there. So he must have agreed with something you were saying.
Cool.
And so here, and I think these are kind of connected questions and comments here. I mean, Pastor Richard, first of all, do I think that there's a mix of declining churches, dysfunctional congregations, declining budgets? I will kind of zero in on that dysfunctional churches portion, because I think, to be honest with you, a lot of things, speaking of your father, Mary Kay, he's calling me on my phone right now while I'm on the air. So I will text him here in a moment.
Is he watching?
I don't
and
know.
He wants
but he's
to
trying
comment.
To watch and get his comment. That's not the way it works. I can't answer the phone on the air, but I'll call you back momentarily when we're off the air, and I'll maybe
Tell him to text
me if it's something important.
Yeah, text us.
You can text me your comment, and I'll read that on the air. Anyway, I want to zero in on that dysfunctional congregations portion, because I think those other two items that you mentioned, Pastor Richard, as far as the declining churches and declining budgets, in large part can be related to dysfunctional congregations.
Sure.
All right, not to say it's always the case, but there can be a connection there. And this also gets to, I think, Pastor Jay's question about, it's in my mind about, how does this affect us? To me, the effect is not that he's some cool pastor. It's that, because the spotlight is being shining on this, we do see some warning signs of dysfunction that should cause us to reflect upon our own churches and our own congregations and the way we treat our pastors. And I've said many times, I know not everybody comes from this tradition, but the tradition that I grew up in was one where, we did have a call process. So the congregation would call the pastor, and then once the pastor was called, and and installed. Pastor Jay here on YouTube says all congregations have a form of dysfunction. Yes, and in our case, it's your spelling of the word dysfunction. Sorry. He'll get me back. He'll get me back.
I thought it was his misspelling of Democrat.
Stop!
I was about to say pot.
I deserved it. I deserved it.
Talk to the kettle much?
Okay, anyway. Well, I totally off the rail now.
We got your back, Pastor Jay.
This dysfunction. I grew up in a tradition where you called the pastor. There was a call team. They called the pastor. But then once the pastor was in the church, all right, then the church actually could not fire the pastor. Only the larger denomination had the authority to fire the pastor. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for that system. It had a lot of problems. I put a little bit too much power in a denomination that in my mind was going theologically where it should not have gone. But the mentality I had was, okay, we're calling the pastor, we're letting the Holy Spirit is really calling the pastor, and that's what who's doing the work, and we're trying to respond to that and listen to that on both sides. You know, the church has to figure out, is this pastor a good fit for what our mission and ministry is? And the pastor also needs to ask some hard questions, and the church needs to be willing to own up to that, and so the pastor can know whether they're a good fit and what they're getting
What
into.
they're walking into.
Yeah, a pastoral match is not a job interview. It's an introduction to a relationship. And so that, but the mentality I had is, but the pastor is still the person to where the buck stops. And as the church, we need to respect that. Unless that pastor is doing something egregiously unbiblical, egregiously sinful, and understand I come from a background where I did have a pastor, I'm not going to relive it, but did something very, very bad. All right. And I still believe this, even after going through that and even after walking through that, that the church has to respect the pastor in that regard, in my mind. Doesn't mean they have carte blanche, but they do have to respect it. And when you don't do that, that's when you can get some of these, and a good pastor has to take input and listen, and it's got to be kind of like a marriage model, you know.
You said it's a relationship.
Yeah, it's got to be a relationship. And if we follow that model, then I think I can avoid this function. What you see, if these accusations against Bethlehem are true, what you're seeing is this lay leadership not respecting the pastoral role of some of their pastors, it sounds like to me, and being abusive towards them, and it almost is like they're trying to flip. It's a power struggle, and we can't be fighting so much over power in the church, because that means, number one, we're just wrong-headed, and number two, we're not getting the work of the ministry done. I'm being told there's some other comments here. Let's see. Richard Blue on
Facebook.
Oh wait, okay. It says churches have dysfunction. I don't believe it. And Pastor Richard spelled dysfunction right.
That sounds like sarcasm. I don't believe it.
And then we do have, okay.
Laughing. He has a laughing emoji.
Okay, yeah.
He does have a laughing emoji, yes. Sorry, I should have said that. And then Clinton Tagamu, and I don't remember, Clinton, if you're the same one who asked us this before, but you said you need help with your kids, need food. And Mary Kay's already put some information there in the comment section on Facebook as far as we're more than happy to help you. More than happy to help you. You can come by literally tomorrow.
Yeah.
Come by tomorrow, 3:30 to 5 if you're local to our area. And we've got our food pantries in the back of our parking lot, and we will help you out. So if you're in our immediate area, come on by, please do, and we would absolutely help you out. And then Pastor Richard here also said amen, probably something that I was on my soapbox about, I'm guessing. So anyway, sorry, go, your turn.
Yeah, and just what we were saying with all of that, I think you hit the nail on the head there too, is that too often we see power struggles within a congregation itself, power struggles from congregation to congregation, and territorialism in the church. And again, that takes all of the focus off of Christ and puts it onto ourselves. And so again, just like we're talking about with money, where's your heart at? well, with these other things too, we have to ask ourselves, where is our heart truly at? Is it for serving God, for proclaiming the gospel, for serving the church body? Because there needs to be a unity, not giving license to these. If these accusations are true for what the lay leadership is doing, then there has to be accountability as well. So again, there's a balance with it. But like you said, we still respect the position. We respect the authority, because that's the hierarchy that Jesus has given us. That he is the head of the church, but there is a structure within the church also that helps us function for the sake of good order. And that might be a product, maybe I'm reading too much into this, it might be a product of the seeker-sensitive movement, that we've shifted the focus off of how can I glorify God, what can I do for the church, to what can the church do for me. So as soon as we start to look at it that way, then our focus is off, and it's a lot easier for people to just up and leave and church hop and shop and all of these things, and that's not good for the kingdom, for unity.
Well, and I do think you mentioned when you make it all about us. I mean, that's what leads these power struggles. Because what is the search for power other than it's a self-centered
Personal
desire.
glory.
It's a personal glory, right? And that's not what was it Ryan said, and that to a lesser extent than what we're talking about here. But he made a great point in his message this past weekend, where he said, you ever heard the phrase, you do you?
Yeah.
And he says, I got news for you. You do you is completely the opposite of putting God first.
Yeah, it's incompatible with seek first the kingdom of God.
Right.
Yeah.
And so is, if you're just trying to build up your own power, within the power structure of the church, that is completely opposite of seek ye first the kingdom of God.
Right.
So we got a couple other comments here, I believe. Pastor Richard here on Facebook says, been there, done that. Unfortunately, in Lutheranism, I believe the call process has left room for the hiring mentality versus the calling relationship you mentioned. Not just in Lutheranism. I mean, I'll be honest with you, Pastor Richard, I came from a Presbyterian background. That's what my background was before I joined the Lutheran church. And very similar call process, and very similar in some churches, this idea of like, we're hiring someone, we're hiring an employee. It's like, no, you're entering into a relationship of someone who's going to be your shepherd, of your congregation. Think about that.
And certain churches even have like a contractual time frame. You have to you sign on for this many years at least. Yeah. That's more of a
and it's complicated, because I know there are some employment aspects to it, but we can't be seeing it as identical to an employment relationship. And he goes on, he says, compared to an appointed pastor by a bishop, etc., as we see in Anglicanism, etc., it's a challenge for our polity. It is. I don't think there's and then Pastor Jay here, who has now moved over to Facebook, says, anytime money is exchanged for service, even worship service, the job mentality will prevail. And that's what I was going to get, is when you're dealing with, we're all fallen humans, and no matter what structure you put in place, it's being implemented by fallen imperfect humans, and that's what we see. And when we do have a call process that has this overlap and similarity with an employee-employer relationship, then that's where I think we tend to fall back on what's familiar. What does that even mean? Wait, there's a comment before that. Okay, well, I'll get to that in a second. So anyway, but then you tend to fall back on what's familiar, and what's familiar is that employer-employee relationship. And we don't want to keep this separated out as being some unique thing, and understand it for the unique thing that it is, and appreciate it for the unique thing that it is. All right, and Pastor Jay says, which is why Jeff Beeps should pay for all of us. And then he says Bezos, not Beeps. Autocorrect strikes again. And then Pastor Richard is laughing at Pastor Jay.
I like that, Jeff Beeps.
Jeff Beeps. I agree. Jeff Beeps should pay for all of us.
That's his street cred name. Jeff Beeps.
So it's a tough question, and I glad we have two pastors watching us on the show who, but it is also something that I think it's not just a conversation for pastors to have. It's a conversation for laity to have as well, because it's a relationship, and so we really need to understand that going in. And I think it's important that everybody be on the same page of what the nature of that relationship is going to be, because you don't want to jump into something and then it's a lot harder to get a divorce than it is, to not get married in the first place, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a good analogy, because again, Christ calls the church his bride. There is it's a relational aspect. Yeah, and the pastor being an under shepherd, it should be a representation of that. Yeah.
All right, shall we move on to our next story with the understanding that if you're 30 seconds behind us and you comment on the last story after we start the news story, it's okay.
Yeah.
We'll come back to it. So just say what you want to say. But what's our next story, Ben?
All right, so taking a few beats from our beeps. Beats.
Taking a few beeps
from our first official story.
Literally, beeps.
There's a new website. This comes out of Christian News. The article comes out of Christian News. But there's a ministry watchdog called, I think it's called the Trinity Foundation. The Trinity Foundation.
No affiliation with Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church in Joppa, Maryland.
None whatsoever. But they've made this online service called Pastor Planes. And what this does is that it tracks around 50 different ministry aircraft. Now, these are privately owned aircraft privately owned by ministers or ministries. And it tracks things such as their flight logs, the amount of time, frequency, where they touch down and where they take off, all sorts of things in an effort for transparency of ministry. And actually, the whole reason that they claim that they do this is for that transparency, to give people a sense of trust in, or to point out the lack of trust in certain mega churches and televangelists, especially because that's primarily those churches that have private planes, and how they are using or misusing the church funds, how they're being good stewards. So again, that's kind of those beats that we were talking about that we'll probably pick back up on. One of the things in here it says is, by our calculations, there are days when more than $100,000 is spent on private jet and charter jet travel by televangelists, ministry executives, and Christian university personnel.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
According to my Facebook, Mr. Kasuf is watching.
Hey, Andrew.
Hello, Andrew. How you doing?
Now, presumably, that's $100,000 just for one ministry to spend on one single day on private jet travel. So their official, it says, they told Ministry Watch that our focus is primarily on aircraft usage that we consider to be poor stewardship. So they're coming at it from that angle already. So they're looking for ways that these ministries are misusing their funds. And that's kind of the long and short of it. Now there's 50 different, it's not clear in here how these ministries even get on this watch list or how they get access to all of this information, whether it's publicly available. Maybe it's made publicly available to their congregations and they get it from that. This article doesn't really say, but they've made it, they've compiled all that information and made it publicly available to anybody who wants to see it. Now, again, this is kind of aimed at there's certain articles in here that it links to certain televangelists like Kenneth Copeland, Jesse Duplantis. They were recently in hot water over, like a $74 million jet that they were trying to raise funds.
Saying, I need a new plane.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Gave me a word, said everybody's going to get me a new plane.
Exactly. By this date.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question out there. I don't know if either one of you know the answer to it. And it stems, unfortunately, from watching a lot of, cop serial, TV shows. Don't they have to file a flight plan with the...
Well, and that's what I was getting at. There's probably, I don't know if a FOIA request would apply, because a lot of these, this is a state-regulated, government-regulated industry, and so there might be some, FAA records and things like that they're able to get access to.
Presumably, they've got to hire the pilots, they got to fuel the plane.
Yeah, so there's things they have to file, and Pastor Jay here says that's why I take a Greyhound bus. Well, we're going to see you, because I happen to know where you're going on vacation next month, and we're going to find out if you actually take a Greyhound bus or you could fly there. I'm not going to say where it is. That would be mean on the air. So, anyway.
Well, they do make the point on here that most ministries would be better served using commercial airline, and it would save millions of dollars.
Yeah, and why not? I mean, seriously. I mean, now it did in the article. In fairness, did make the point there are a few very limited circumstances where a private jet may make sense, like when you're trying to go into access a low traffic area where there's not a lot of flights go into there, and you might, based on when you need to get there, you might need to charter a pilot, a private flight, or if you're traveling to a high risk location, the major airlines aren't going to go to, and so I did appreciate that the people who are doing this are not they're not by default to say you could never take a private plane. It gets back to stewardship. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, what's your reason for doing it? If your reason for doing it is because you don't want to mingle with the masses, which frankly is what a lot of this I think boils down to. It's
flat out stated by Kenneth Copeland. He said a lot of his reason for defending the use of private airline is that he said it mingling with public transport. He said a lot of pastors use this time as a sanctuary to connect to God, as if you can't do that on the ground. Mm-hmm. And that, what's offered on these airlines is alcohol. And so there's this influence for alcohol. Is that really a good environment you want a pastor to be around?
Ryan Iwanowski says, are we getting watching creds now too?
Yes.
Hey, Ryan, how you doing?
Going, Ryan?
Okay, but here's the thing, Ryan. So you're watching on YouTube. Facebook, actually, you don't have to comment. It just tells us so-and-so is watching sometimes. Mm-hmm. If they're friends of the person who's in there.
Yeah, they have to be my friends.
Right. And so because they're friends with Mary Kay,
are we
Facebook,
friends, Ryan?
Popped up. Well, he's not on YouTube, so it wouldn't matter.
I know.
YouTube doesn't do that.
Just saying.
So that's why on YouTube, if you want us to give you a shout out, you got to comment, and then yes, we will absolutely give you a shout out. So thank you, Ryan.
There's a couple on Facebook.
Let's see.
Hey, hi, Ryan.
All right. I'm not going to restate what Pastor Jay said in his next comment. And you can just read in the comment section. Pastor Richard said, you guys are on a roll today. Copeland said he didn't want to be in a tube with demons.
Yeah.
And Pastor Jay explaining his earlier statement, which he said crap, and now he's explaining crap excuses. Isn't that where the ministry is and the people are? In Coach. Yes! Yeah, thankfully Mary Kay did not have the headphones on at that point, so I didn't blow her eardrums out. Yes, exactly. I mean, did Jesus just go and hang out with the Sanhedrin, or did he go and mingle with the people?
He had a lot of harsh words for the Sanhedrin. He might call the Sanhedrin demons. He called them a brood of viper, whitewashed tombs.
So I mean, seriously, that's how are you doing ministry if you're avoiding the people that you need to minister to?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say that I bet you Lori and that group that went to Guatemala, were you part of that one?
I've been there several times, yeah.
But the group that got all separated and were sent to various different parts of the country.
No, that time I wasn't with them.
When they were trying to get down there. Yeah, we had a group of people who were going on a mission trip to Guatemala, and they just got it wasn't easy. The whole getting down there wasn't easy. Let's just put it that way. They probably would have appreciated a private plane where they could have all just gotten on and flown down there.
Well, Pastor Richard here is saying that y'all haven't bought Pastor Jay a plane yet. Come on. It's time for Trinity to join the big leagues. So Pastor Jay, just for you, when we see you next, when you come in, it's a J plane, okay? Here is your J plane, ready? Just for you.
It has the same flight trajectory as Jeff Bezos' flight for about 10 seconds.
It's by your feet over here. To your right. I didn't exactly take a lot of the time to design a great aerodynamic plane. It's not going to go straight. I don't know why you think. Just like Pastor Jay, its trajectory gets a little crooked sometimes. I'm going to get in so much trouble. Anyway, but yeah, it gets back to stewardship. I mean, that's the whole point. It's like the justifications that are used for this. And keep in mind, it's not just pastors. I mean, this group is studying, Christian university personnel as well. It's like, if you're a Christian university personnel or person, I got news for you. I mean, you have no argument. I mean, you want to say, if Kenneth Copeland wants to come to say, well, I'm so famous, I'm afraid somebody's going to try to assassinate me. Bullpucky, but still, it's still a better excuse than some no-name university vice president of student toenail clippings that, nobody's going to know from Adam. And so it's like, what's your excuse?
We get a plaque that says Vice President of Student Toenail Clipping.
So I just, yeah, I mean, we should, nope, yeah, I'm gonna put that on the thing. Sorry, you gonna give me my thing? Yeah. You just need to have it, change it to say Vice President of Student Toenail Clippings. No, I don't know if I can put it anywhere where it's gonna be on camera. Let's stick it right here in front of Ben. Nope. So
What are you doing?
he's making my sign of Vice President Student Toenail Clippings. Oh, this has gotten completely off the rails. But no, I mean, it comes down
And you're
to,
complaining about Pastor Day going off church.
I know. Well, we always do on this show to some extent. Come on. But no, that's but it's a matter of and I guess the problem I have with it is it goes beyond stewardship. I mean, it's poor stewardship, yes. It's poor witness for Jesus, even more importantly. Because understand, when you do things like this, and I'm going to get worked up about it because this is something I feel strongly about, but when you do things like this, people, like it or not, we are ambassadors of Christ. If you are a Christian, you are an ambassador of Christ here on earth. And when people see you, Kenneth Copeland, when they see you, Jesse Duplantis, they will automatically attribute what you do and how you act to Christianity as a whole and to Jesus Christ himself. And so you are impacting and detrimentally impacting the message of the gospel in the world today by setting this kind of ridiculously bad example. Soapbox down.
Yeah, misrepresenting Christ. Absolutely.
So as Christians, how are we
Don't buy a private plane.
how are we to respond to this now?
We need
What
to
is
call
it?
it out. We need to call it out.
So you're okay with what this
What I
group
just
is
did?
doing?
Yes, I'm okay with
No.
what I just did.
What this group is doing,
What
I mean,
this website is.
I'm
doing,
assuming
tracking-
now.
go back to the story.
Go back to assuming
Your
what Ben-
producer is telling you to go back to the story.
there's some assumptions that this statement is based upon, but assuming, because remember what Ben said at the very beginning is the article didn't say how they're getting access to this information. All right, two wrongs don't make a right. So if you're getting this information in an inappropriate manner, then no, I don't excuse it, regardless, despite the fact that the behavior that they're trying to point out is in and itself wrong behavior. But if they are getting it through proper channels, FAA records, FOIA requests, whatever it may be, because I'm not familiar enough with the FAA and where this information, how publicly accessible it is. But if they are getting it through proper channels, then I absolutely have no problem with what they're doing. I think because it's a group of Christians trying to hold another group of purported Christians accountable. Right. And that's what we're supposed to do. That's what you're the vice president in charge of student toenail clippings. You can't see it on the camera though. There, that's not coming out. So they won't stay right there. How about no? Well, kind of here. You can kind of see part of it. Mr. Stapler. Well, it's all the way down here. You won't see him.
No, it's from the table in front of him.
On the table in front. There you go.
There you go.
He is the vice president in charge of student toenail clippings. Anyway, so. But if they're getting through proper channels, then it's Christians trying to hold other Christians accountable. And that's what is sadly, I think, missing in the church in many regards today, is that, there's a method to do it and there's a gracious way to do it, but it still needs to be done. That's how we check ourselves. That's how a group of fallen... Let me give you an example. All right. Have you ever heard of the traditional, probably have, tradents, where, in the oral tradition, the way before, a lot of these biblical stories, and it's not just in Israel, but in a lot of ancient cultures, before these things were written down, they were passed down from generation to generation.
Oral tradition.
In oral tradition. And they would, and so the group would act as a corrective. In other words, because they'd get together as a group and someone would recite the story, and they've heard the story so many times that if the tradent, that's the name for the person who is actually relaying the story, if they mess something up, then the group would correct them. Right. And that's how you are able, it's amazing in these oral cultures, how much you can preserve a story without it being written down, just purely through oral tradition, through generation after generation after generation, and it stays the same because you have this group correction that occurs. in a similar way, the way you're going to stay true to biblical teaching is if you, number one, get involved in the Bible as a community so everybody knows it. That's something that's missing from modern Christianity today to begin with.
Biblical
and
literacy.
then you have this group correction so that we stay on that path.
And incidentally, that very same example that you use is also an argument for why we have so many different manuscripts that are copies of copies. When you look at the way that the Bible came together, why that's even better than having just one original manuscript, because just like with blockchain, it's checks and balances. It's a lot easier to spot, when you've got 10 different manuscripts and there's a discrepancy in one of them, you can easily spot which one has the discrepancy. And again, it's amazing when you look at all of that, how very little variance there is in the manuscripts that we do have. Really nothing that changes the message of the gospel too. And so, and that's just kind of a side tangent that, we can trust the Bible because of this checks and balances. And so I think that also carries over into ecclesiology, into how we function as a church, that there needs to be iron sharpening iron, that there needs to be, the gifts of the individual believer are to be used for the body of believers. They're not to be used for our own gain, again, going back to that personal glory, but they're to be used for the edification of all. And so by hoarding our wealth in private planes and private properties and all of these things that God has given to us, let us not forget that, then we're missing out on edifying on using that for a greater kingdom impact.
Absolutely. Amen.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to our last story of the evening, shall we? Nobody's
thing.
commenting anymore, so apparently they're sick of us talking about the pastor planes. Our last story of the evening comes from, one person criticizing another person. It started with the New York Times. All right. The New York Times published, an opinion piece by Michelle Goldberg that was titled "The Christian Right is in Decline and It's Taking America with It." And she has, in this piece, she has said a number of things about, essentially her premise was, if you look back to the era when George Bush was president, Pastor Jay here says, "I just want to be a plain pastor." P-L-A-I-N. See what he did there? Okay. I get it.
Well done.
So if you look back at the era when George Bush was president, the second George Bush was president, it said at that point in time, the culture was such that the majority of Americans agreed with the Christian right on a number of these hot topic social issues, whether it be abortion, whether it be same-sex marriage, things like that. And there was a general feeling that because the culture was going in a certain direction, that the next generation was going to be filled with, homeschool. The kids who were being homeschooled in that generation were going to be the people in the position of power in the next generation. And so there was a general, according to this article, a feeling of optimism that the influence of the Christian morality and values was going to grow. Well, fast forward now, to today, and the exact opposite has happened. And this article points to a study that was put out by a group, it's PRRI. I'm trying to remember what it stood for here. And I'm not finding it. But it's a study, a survey that basically tried to poll people to find out what their religious affiliation was. And it said that they did this in 2020. They did a census of American religion based on a survey of nearly 500,000 people, and it showed that whereas in 2006, 23% of the population identified as a white evangelical, in 2006 that declined to 14.5%, and as a matter of fact, the percentage of people who were identified as white mainland Protestants actually outnumbered, was higher than the percentage of white evangelicals, is what the study says. And so this author then goes on to say, well, because the white evangelical population is decreasing, they had this great expectation that their influence was going to be overpowering, and now they're seeing the exact opposite. So essentially, if I could summarize her point in a mental picture, they're like a cornered animal. and they're feeling threatened. And so they're lashing out emotionally. And she says that in one of her sentences here, this helps explain not just the rise of Donald Trump, but also the growth of QAnon and even the escalating conflagration over critical race theory. So she's drawing an equality, if you want to say, between evangelical, well, specifically white evangelical Christianity and QAnon, for example, and drawing a direct correlation between them.
By the way, that's the Public Religion Research Institute.
Okay.
It's PRR.
Well, in response, she goes on, and we can maybe get into more of the specifics about her statements here in a little bit. But then the Christian Post published an article about some statements that were made by Richard Land, who is the outgoing president of Southern Evangelical Seminary. And Richard Land took the New York Times, and this New York Times author, Michelle Goldberg, took her to task and said that her conclusions in her op-ed illustrated astounding bias, in his words. He says, for example, her assertion that conservative Christians are animated by a triumphalist ethos and want to take over American culture is completely wrong-headed. This is what the article says, and the quote from Richard Land says, "We didn't begin this culture war. Politics is downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from religion, or alternatively, your worldview. Progressives are bringing the worldview, which is their religion, into culture and into politics. Evangelicals are doing the same thing." So basically what Richard Land is saying is like, this is not, it's not like evangelical Christians set out to start some kind of a culture war or a culture dominance. It's just, look, progressives are bringing their cultural norms into the conversation. So are evangelicals. That's what he's basically saying. Evangelicals aren't doing anything different from what anybody else who brings their worldview into the discussion is doing. And he said that he thought the op-ed was the perfect example of wish being the father of thought. And then one other point that he made here, he says, any research, and this is questioning the PRI study, he says, any research or assertion that mainline Protestantism, which has virtually disappeared before our eyes in my lifetime, has overtaken evangelicals in terms of a percentage of the population, is research that has moved into an alternative universe. I don't know exactly what he feels, but yeah. And then Pastor Jay says here, and the gospel is getting lost in the battle. We were just having a conversation about this earlier today, but yeah, maybe we'll get to that about, where we get so caught up in some of these other issues, do we lose sight on the gospel and bringing that to the world? But anyway, so I have some thoughts on the op-ed and the response, but I've read the story, so you go first.
Yeah, and I like the point that he makes that, evangelicals are just doing the same thing that anybody else, that everybody who has a worldview, which everybody does, brings it into the conversation, and it is a natural byproduct that when you have competing worldviews that are just incompatible with one another, then there's going to be friction. There's going to be disagreements. And naturally, as human beings, when we have disagreements, then our emotions get involved. And so there's a lot of this. Yeah, I think the whole conflation with white evangelicalism and QAnon is kind of overblown. If anything, he does make that point in there, like how he himself, he'd be the epitome of a white evangelical, and yet he had to Google QAnon because he didn't know what it was. I think that's, kind of been overstated. But it's an easy label to slap onto people to say that, oh, white evangelicals, you're conspiracy theorists, and that's an easy way to dismiss and not engage in the conversation. But to Pastor Jay's and your point, Ken, that what gets lost in the midst of this is the gospel, and I think that's where we need to focus. That's where we need to circle back to. And I really like what Mr. Land said at the end of this article. Because it kind of hits on that as well, that it's the gospel is about transforming lives. And so he says, if America is going to be revived, it's going to be one person, one family, one church at a time. Government is not a locomotive, it's a caboose. When the people change, the government will change, not Washington to the people. The salt of the law can change actions, behaviors, and habits. It's only the light of the gospel that can change attitudes, beliefs, and hearts.
That's a fantastic quote, and I think that I'm glad you mentioned it because I was going to mention it too, because I think that directly gets to Pastor Jay's point here. It's like, what is, as Christians, what's our priority? It's not to say that, if it comes up and there are going to be times when it arises, we should be politically engaged and all that, political issues or sometimes overlapping issues that have a political spin on them or a political context that we're going to have to address. But where is our primary focus? If our primary focus is on we need to change this law, we need to change that law, then we're being naive because the government is downstream from culture, right?
Which is downstream from worldview.
Right. And so that's not what we need to focus on more so is, and again, keep understanding, I'm not saying there aren't some kind of an imminent threat, for lack of better words, things that come up that need to be addressed. I get that. But on the big picture, if we're focused more on the gospel and bringing the gospel, then that's going to change worldviews and that's going to change culture. And then you're going to see the government. You see that in history, that the government policies follow the cultural trends. I mean, that's why that culture comes first. And so trying to just, put a Band-Aid, it's kind of like trying to put your finger in the hole in a dam and not stop, where the leak's coming from in the first place or whatever.
Right.
And Pastor Jay, we need more salmon that swim upstream. And then he says, I am a salmon.
Who said that?
Pastor Jay says he's a salmon.
I am a salmon.
Okay. You're swimming upstream. To a certain extent, isn't that what Jesus tells us to expect in the culture? We are kind of like fish swimming upstream against the stream of culture.
Yeah, this should not surprise us when we see opposition and competing worldviews. And so then the question becomes, how do we respond to it? Do we respond in kind with animosity? And we've touched on this before in previous episodes of like the Loudoun County thing with people walking out and all of that. So how do we respond when we encounter others with opposing worldviews? What's a practical way to share the love of Christ?
Well, I think this provides us a good example to bring up that conversation, because here we have an instance where Ms. Goldberg published an op-ed that attacked white evangelical Christianity, and Mr. Land, and I'm not sure if he's a pastor, I apologize, but Richard Land responded. And so we have an illustration of the way that one Christian responded to something in the culture that was opposed to Christianity. So it kind of gives us a concrete example to say, okay, was this the proper way to respond? And will surprise no one, I'll say yes and no. There were certain things that I thought, at least, and I'm going to speak in terms of the Christian Post article, because keep in mind, our information about what Mr. Land said is coming through the lens of what the Christian Post decided to publish. And so I don't know if there are other things out there. So let me speak more to the Christian Post vis-a-vis the New York Times, as opposed to Mr. Land vis-a-vis the New York Times. The way the Christian Post addressed it in their article, it wasn't it wasn't wrong. Nothing they said was incorrect. Did it really give the full picture? I mean, I don't think anybody can or should deny Miss Goldberg's starting premise and her background and the history. She's absolutely right. As far as the direction of the culture that it has taken from 2006 through today, that's entirely accurate. And I think it is also a fact of fallen human nature that, and we were talking about how even in churches, you got people who want to make a play for power. Why do we think that's only going to be limited to, your ruling bodies and your individual churches and not to society at large? Of course it's going to be. Right. And so is there a danger that if, back in 2006, evangelical Christianity, or white evangelical Christianity, as this was talking about it, is thinking, oh, look at the influence we're having now, everything's good, and then, see it go downhill very, very rapidly, that people aren't going to respond in ways that want to see them trying to cling to power? Sure, that's entirely possible, and that is a danger that we need to check ourselves against.
Because there again, when we do lash out like that, that's a misrepresentation of Christ, and that's, people are going to equate that with Christianity.
Right.
When
we're ambassadors, act like it, Now, that being said, so that's kind of was this the proper response? My no part of it, because I don't think I think it really took the tone of a hit piece almost on the op-ed. And, if we're to be honest with people and stand out the way we should to the world, you give credit where credit is due, so that you don't distract from the focus on where the issue really lies. And I think when you make it seem like the entire piece was just completely out to lunch, then you're gonna lose credibility, because they're gonna say, really? Because these points I thought were pretty fair that she made. And so I do think we need to say that where it is. Were there other parts in the piece that I thought were problematic? Absolutely. Where, for example, talking about the study, this one I found very, very interesting. So the study made a two different categories. There was white evangelical and there was
And
white
white
mainline Protestant. What's the name of our church there, Ben?
Trinity Evangelical Lutheran.
What are we? Are we white evangelical or are
Both
we,
and?
I you know,
I'm
and
glad
so-
you picked up on that, because I was like, what really is the distinction between mainline and evangelical? Because I think what it's getting at, and maybe I'm off base here, but I think the distinction in making it mainline Protestant versus evangelical is that now evangelical has kind of been radicalized. The term has been radicalized.
The term has been radicalized, yeah.
And so there's kind of a push for a distinction between.
But that's a
Your
cultural
more
war too.
traditional-
It's
yeah.
we want to attach a label to something so that you'll create an impression of that, and then that impression will dictate how you think about larger groups and treat them. So there was a problem there, where it's like the study itself has some question to it, because you're asking people to self-identify and you're giving them categories so they might feel they're not sure which one they fall under.
Yeah.
You know?
And when you combine the two, because I do see them as kind of the same category, that's still like, what, 30%?
Right. So that was problematic, and there was a lot, and I won't go through the whole thing of the op-ed, but there was a lot of inconsistency on the author's part. Like, she says that, because evangelicals are now feeling threatened, that basically everything they say is just them spouting off conspiracy theories that they're just irrationally holding to. Well, if I were to flip that around and say, well, does that mean back in the Bush era, when evangelicalism was supposedly had all the power and authority, and the more progressive viewpoint did not, does that mean we should have disregarded everything the progressives said back then because they were the ones feeling threatened, so they must just be believing a bunch of conspiracy theories? Yeah, you've got to evaluate things on their merits. You can't just attach labels to things. And so the piece was filled with things like that. So as for when these things come up, how do we address them? And here's the other thing: is like, part of me wonders. I don't know. I'm of two minds about it. All right, you can't just concede the culture war, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate to even use that word, but if you don't address anything that comes up, then culture is going to keep moving in a certain way, and it's a way that's going to take it further away from God and create a landscape that's harder to preach the gospel in. At the flip side of the coin, though, is what Pastor Jay is getting at, is that if we come across if we address it too much, then it almost comes across like that's all we care about are these surface issues, and it gets in the way of the gospel message, and we lose credibility there too. So where do you draw the line as far as when you just kind of let things go and when you speak up about them?
I think, and we try to be fair on this show. I think we try to toe that line of filtering everything through that Christian lens, through that Christian perspective. So when you do have certain things, I think you just mentioned about, something that's blatantly an urgent issue that we see, like something that's endangering freedom of speech that would create that landscape where it's difficult to preach the gospel. I think that's fair for us to speak out against. Something that's an imminent threat to it, I think is fair for us to speak out against. And the church has always been the moral compass of society. And so when we see that the culture shifting away from the church, then it's no wonder that the moral compass of the society is off. And so our focus needs to be continuing to be that moral compass, speaking out where we see imminent, I hate to even use the term threat, because that kind of plays into that whole image of a cornered animal. But when we see an imminent, for lack of a better term, threat to the conduciveness of being that moral compass, and so.
Well, I guess this is where I come down, and I don't know if this is even a standard of that's well defined at all, but just kind of my thoughts. First of all, if I see someone attacking Jesus, then, and what I mean by misrepresenting Jesus, I guess I should say, then, I do in those circumstances kind of feel like that's a situation where I should, gently and respectfully speak up to that he's my Lord, and I want to make sure people have an accurate understanding of him. So, and you see this in examples of people who misrepresent who Jesus really was, and what his teaching was, and all that. But again, that can be done in a gentle and respectful way. If I see people, in contrary, attacking Christians, then I think a little more about it, because it's like, all right, at that point, where's my desire to respond coming from? Is it because I just feel personally attacked? In which case, that shouldn't be a motivation for me responding. They're not attacking Christ; they're attacking Christians. And I tend to think, as a general rule, the better way to change people's opinions about Christians is to show them, not tell them.
Yeah.
Is to go out and show the love of Christ to the world, because that's going to make a more receptive audience, as opposed to outside of one person says Christians are X, and then Christians come up and say, no, we're not. Yes, you are. No, we're not. Yes, we're not. The audience out there is just going, I'm done. I'm out. I'm not listening. I don't think you win too many people over that way. Whereas if you show them the love of Christ, you tend to do. So attacking Christ, I'm probably going to speak up. Attacking Christians, I'm probably not. Killing unborn babies, I'm probably going to speak up. And that's where we get to that
Right.
third category of, when you're talking like imminent threats. There are certain things, if someone's, advocating for, certain acts that are, very dangerous. And I just obviously
Antithetical to the
Right.
gospel.
And antithetical to the gospel, but even more than that, just, there are certain moral atrocities. It's kind of like, why didn't people speak up earlier during World War II? Why did they
Right.
step in and take action earlier when the evidence was overwhelming that these evil acts were being committed against the Jewish people? That's a type of situation where the Christian church should speak out, and not to say that nobody did, but should have been very unified in voice of saying, no, this is evil and we need to call it out.
Right.
They're not directly attacking Christ, they're not directly attacking Christians, but they're doing something that needs to be called out. And obviously that's the extreme example we can always give, but I just use that to illustrate a point. So attacking Christ, yes. Attacking Christians, probably no. Committing egregious moral evil, yes.
Yeah, and that falls in line with following the example of the apostles. I mean, they were no strangers to calling people out when they needed to be called out. Look at the example of the exchange between the apostles and Simon the sorcerer, right? He tried to buy the Holy Spirit. Like, how much can I give you to get this power that you have? And they rightly called him out, and we're like,
The
look,
same
that's
value as the private jet. No, sorry.
right. So they weren't strangers to calling people out. But at the same time, when it's Christian versus Christian, look at the Apostle Paul when he's saying, some people say I follow Paul, some say I follow Apollos. He says, who after all is Paul? Who is Apollos?
It's not about me. It's not about
only
us.
follow me in as much as I imitate Christ.
Right.
So again, there's that model, there's that line, distinction. Call out blatant heresy like Simon the sorcerer, but when it's Christian against Christian, like, we should seek unity.
Turn the other cheek. I mean, it's just like, if it's a personal attack, then, and that's kind of where I come down in this article. And I know we're running a little bit later, so we probably should wrap it up. But when I look at this article, that's, I should say, at least a question that arose in my mind. As I read the original op-ed, it did come across to me as, this is an attack on Christians. I may agree with the Christian Post and some of the responses that were launched against it, but I do wonder, was our time best served? Is it something that needed to be responded to? Is that the best way to respond to it? Is something like that going to directly influence the culture so much? I don't know. I'm open either way, but I did question about this. Like, okay, this is the New York Times writing an attack saying all Christians are evil. That's what. Okay, I'm exaggerating. Okay, it's hyperbole. Don't get me. Please understand.
Par for the course.
But it's kind of like, okay, it was the New York Times. What do you expect?
Yeah.
And you're going to do this every time they write an article like this because you're going to be very busy.
Yeah.
Our time might be better served trying to influence the culture in other ways.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. That it? All right, this is the part where we vamp for about 20, 30 seconds in case anybody has a comment. I'm going to ask if anybody out there watching, please leave a comment, especially if you're watching on Facebook. The last thing I want is the final comment on the show to be Pastor Jay saying, I am a salmon. There's just, we need something else on there other than that to end on. But anyway, I do thank everybody. Hey, it was great to be back. It's been a while since I've sat in this chair. I want to say a special thank you to Ben and to Mary Kay for holding down the fort last week. I know that was probably a little bit awkward with the empty chair sitting next to you.
We made it work.
You made it work. You made it work brilliantly. And so I really do appreciate that. And again, I want to thank everybody for the prayers for Mary Kay's dad. He's doing fine. I did, in case you saw me looking at my phone earlier, he and I have texted back and forth since he tried to call me here on the air. It's not an emergency. Everything's good. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here anymore. And so I do want to thank everybody for that. And apparently, we're going to end on I am a salmon. So thank you all very much for watching.
I am an S. I am an essay. SALMON.
That'd work. That'd work. All right.
That's what we're ending on, I guess.
Could be worse. We could go out on the Austin Powers theme song.
Oh, no.
Say nothing more. There's certain things that people have been saying around the water cooler that we agreed ahead of time we were not going to address on this show.
Oh, here we go.
We have a YouTube comment. Ryan Amanowski, great job, guys. Always love TTL. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan.
For not only watching, but for at least giving us a lot of comment after the salmon, so we don't have to end out on that. We really appreciate it. All right. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Mary Kay. And thank you to everybody. We will be back next week, right? What's the date today?
Yes.
The 21st. We will be back next week, where we will sing happy belated birthday to our producer, my lovely wife, whose birthday is going to be over the course of the next week.
Hey, shout out to my brother. It's his birthday today. And shout out to my other brother whose birthday was Monday.
There you go. So shout out to everybody. Happy birthday. And if it's your birthday, happy birthday to you as well. What? Where am I looking? It hasn't popped up yet. Facebook. All right. It's not coming. We're going to wait. We're waiting for it. Can I have a drum roll? It's not.
I believe it says, yay, salmon.
Why is it not popping up? I'm not getting it on my Facebook feed is not updating for some reason. And
It's still downstream.
I'm going. All right. I just refresh the feed there, but now it's just all completely messed up. Now there it is. Yay, salmon! This is like a battle, you know. He just wants the salmon to be the last thing on it. All right. Speaking of salmon, I want to go eat dinner. So, thank you. See you next week, Wednesday, 5:30. God bless.